You owe this family after everything we did for you. My former father-in-law said that standing on the porch of my $4 million house 5 years after he threw my suitcase into the street. I'm Natasha Dapson, and at that moment, all three of them were standing in front of me again. Richard, Diane, and my ex-husband Caleb. Same people who called me too poor to belong in their family. Same people who stopped answering my calls the night they locked me out of their home. But now, Richard's hands were shaking. Diane wouldn't even look me in the eye, and Caleb looked like he hadn't slept in days. Then Richard pulled out a thick legal folder and dropped it on my kitchen counter. "We're out of options," he said quietly. I opened the first page and froze when I saw my name connected to Caleb's company, because that company was never supposed to involve me anymore. For a second, nobody spoke. Rain tapped against the massive glass windows behind them while I flipped through the papers slowly, my chest tightening more with every page. Corporate filings, investor statements, legal notices, and buried between all of it were screenshots of strategy documents I recognized instantly. My documents. The same proposal I spent months building at our old apartment while Caleb promised me we were building a future together. I looked up at him. "Why is my work in here?" Caleb rubbed both hands over his face but didn't answer. That told me everything. 5 years ago, when his startup crashed, his parents blamed me for all of it. Diane told people I was dragging Caleb down financially. Richard said I brought embarrassment into their family because I came from nothing. And Caleb? He stood there silently while his father carried my suitcase outside in front of their neighbors like I was some stranger overstaying her welcome. I still remembered the sound the suitcase wheels made scraping across the driveway. And after that night, nothing. No calls, no apologies, not even when my mother ended up in the hospital 2 years later. It was like I had been erased from their lives completely. Until now. Diane finally stepped inside, staring around my house with this tight expression on her face. The marble floors, the vaulted ceilings, the city skyline glowing through the windows behind me. She used to laugh at the apartment Caleb and I rented over a dry cleaner. Now she looked uncomfortable just standing in my kitchen. Richard pointed at the paperwork. "You need to sign those tonight." I almost laughed. "You disappear for 5 years," I said, "then show up demanding favors?" "This isn't a favor," Richard snapped. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. That's when I noticed something else. The Rolex he wore every single day during my marriage was gone. And outside in the driveway, the family's usual luxury SUV had been replaced with an older sedan that still had rental stickers on the windshield. Something was very wrong. Caleb finally looked at me for the first time since arriving, and in the quietest voice imaginable, he said, "If you don't help us, my father could lose everything by Friday." My father already sold the lake house. The second Caleb said that, Diane shot him a sharp look like he'd revealed something he wasn't supposed to. I leaned back slowly in my chair, studying all three of them. 5 years ago, these people acted untouchable. Richard Dapson practically introduced himself with his net worth. Their family dinners felt more like business meetings where everyone competed to sound richer than the person sitting next to them. And somehow I was always the embarrassment in the room, not because I did anything wrong, because I didn't come from money. Diane used to make little comments disguised as jokes. "Oh, Natasha, you probably didn't grow up around wine pairings." Or, "Caleb has always dated women from good families. This is new for him." Caleb would squeeze my hand under the table afterward and whisper, "Ignore them." But he never actually defended me, not once. The crazy part is, I wasn't even depending on their money. Before Caleb's company failed, I had a stable marketing job. I paid half our rent. When his startup started bleeding cash, I was the one covering groceries while he chased investors across the city. I was also the one building the presentations, the customer strategy, the expansion model. Most of the ideas investors praised Caleb for at the beginning, those late night brainstorming sessions were mine too. But publicly, it was always Caleb's company, Caleb's vision, Caleb's genius. And I let it happen because I thought we were building a marriage, not competing for credit. I looked back down at the documents on my counter. The language was too familiar. Entire sections had been lifted directly from files I created years ago. You used my proposal, I said quietly. Richard immediately cut in. That material belonged to the company. No, I replied, staring directly at him now. It belonged to me. The room went still. Then Caleb swallowed hard and said something that made my stomach drop. There are lawyers involved now, Natasha. I narrowed my eyes. What kind of lawyers? Caleb hesitated. But Richard answered for him, the kind trying to take everything we have. And suddenly, for the first time all night, Richard Dapson looked afraid. The investors found out. Richard said it like the words physically hurt him to say. He loosened his tie with shaky fingers while Diane sat rigidly beside him, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. I crossed my arms. Found out what? Nobody answered immediately. That silence told me this was bigger than debt. Much bigger. Caleb finally stepped forward and slid another document toward me. Read page 6. I flipped through the file until I saw it. A highlighted paragraph. My chest tightened instantly. The business model described there was nearly identical to the proposal I created during the first year of our marriage. Same customer structure, same rollout strategy, same regional scaling system, except my name was nowhere on it. I looked at Caleb slowly. You copied my work. It wasn't like that, he said too quickly. I almost laughed at the nerve of that response. For years, the media treated Caleb like some self-made tech genius. I'd seen interviews online accidentally while scrolling, magazine covers, business podcasts, articles praising the Dapson expansion model. Meanwhile, after they threw me out, I rebuilt my life alone. I freelanced for months just to survive. Slept 4 hours a night. Took consulting contracts nobody else wanted. And eventually, I rebuilt my original concept from scratch under my own company. That company was now worth $12.8 million. And apparently, the Dapsons had just realized exactly how dangerous that fact was. Richard leaned forward. The company is under investigation. There are lawsuits, Diane added quietly. Former employees, investors, banks, Caleb said. Everyone's coming after us. I stared at him. So that's why you're here. Richard's expression hardened again, like his pride was fighting against desperation. You're still connected to the original filings, he admitted. Your documents were part of the early funding approvals. I felt my stomach twist. That explained why my name appeared in the paperwork. Caleb never removed me completely, not because he respected me, because he needed my work. Then Diane suddenly reached for my hand. We always considered you family, she whispered. I pulled my hand back immediately. The audacity of that almost made me angry enough to laugh. Then Richard pushed a pen across the counter toward me, and in a cold, flat voice he said, sign the transfer papers or Caleb goes to prison alone. Prison? The word barely left my mouth before Diane started crying. Not dramatic crying, real panic. The kind that happens when someone finally realizes money can't protect them anymore. Richard stood up immediately, irritated. Stop it, Diane. No, tell her the truth. She snapped through tears. She deserves to know now. I looked at Caleb. He couldn't even meet my eyes. That's when I understood something horrifying. This wasn't a business problem anymore. This was criminal. Caleb sat down across from me and pressed both palms against his forehead like he was trying to hold himself together. The investigators found internal emails, he said quietly. My stomach tightened. What emails? He swallowed hard. Messages between my father and the legal department about restructuring ownership before the company started collapsing. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Restructuring ownership. I already knew what that meant. Richard stepped in quickly. You were never supposed to be involved in any of this. I stared at him in disbelief. That's funny considering you used my entire proposal. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. And that silence confirmed it. 5 years ago, when the company started failing, they didn't throw me out because they hated me. They threw me out to protect themselves. Caleb finally looked at me, guilt written all over his face. My father said investors trusted the company more without you attached to it, he admitted. He thought I looked poor enough to scare them. I cut in sharply. Nobody answered. Because it was true. The humiliation, the insults, the sudden exile from the family. None of it was emotional or impulsive. It was strategic. They erased me publicly while privately keeping my work tied to the company behind the scenes. And now that investigators were digging through records, my name was surfacing again. Diane wiped her eyes desperately. If you sign the documents, the lawyers can separate you from liability. I looked at her carefully. And protect the family? Richard spoke before she could answer. Yes. At least he was honest about it now. Then Caleb leaned forward suddenly. Please, Natasha, he said. I know I failed you. I know I should have defended you. But if this gets worse, his voice cracked. My father's saying they could charge me personally. I studied his face for several seconds. And then I realized something even worse. He still wasn't apologizing for betraying me, only for getting caught. I slowly closed the folder. You threw me out to protect your empire, I said quietly. Then I looked directly at Richard. And now you want me to save it? Nobody answered me. The only sound in the kitchen was the rain outside and Diane quietly crying into a tissue. Richard stood near the counter with his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. Even now, even with his empire collapsing around him, he looked offended that I wasn't immediately helping them. That part almost impressed me. 5 years, and he still believed power belonged to him. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway table near the entrance. Behind me, Caleb's voice turned nervous. Natasha, what are you doing? I opened a drawer and pulled out my own folder. Thicker than theirs. Heavier, too. When I dropped it on the kitchen island, the sound alone made all three of them look up. Richard frowned. What is this? My attorneys prepared it last week. The color drained from Caleb's face instantly. Because suddenly he understood something. I already knew. Weeks earlier, one of Caleb's former employees had contacted me privately after seeing interviews about my company online. He recognized similarities between my software platform and the early systems Caleb's company used years ago. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then my lawyers started digging. And what they found was worse than I imagined. Internal emails, draft agreements, investor presentations using sections copied directly from my original proposal files. There were even conversations discussing how removing me publicly would create a cleaner executive image for investors, an image wealthy enough to fit the Dapson name. I looked directly at Richard. You didn't throw me out because I was hurting the company, I said calmly. You threw me out because you thought I made the family look poor. Diane covered her mouth. Richard said nothing, because there was nothing left to deny. I opened the folder and slid several documents across the counter. Legal notices, ownership claims, intellectual property disputes. Caleb stared at the pages like he was watching his entire future disappear in real time. You're suing us? He asked quietly. No, I replied. I'm protecting myself. Richard slammed his palm against the marble counter hard enough to make Diane jump. After everything this family gave you? I almost laughed. Your family gave me humiliation, I said. I built everything else myself. That finally broke Caleb. He stood up abruptly. Natasha, please. If the investigators think you're hostile now, they'll tear the company apart. They already are, I replied, and that was the truth. Federal investigators had already expanded the case. Investors were cooperating. Former employees were handing over internal communications. The company's financial records were being audited line by line. The Dapson empire wasn't collapsing. It had already collapsed. They just came to me hoping I'd stand underneath the rubble with them. Caleb's voice softened. I know I failed you. I looked at him carefully. For years, I'd imagined hearing those words. But standing there now, they felt empty, because apologies don't erase choices. You stood there while they threw me out, I said quietly. You let them treat me like I was worthless after everything I did for you. He looked down immediately. No excuses this time, no defense, just silence. Over the next few months, everything became public. Caleb accepted a plea agreement tied to financial misconduct charges. Richard lost multiple properties trying to settle lawsuits and investor claims. Their social circle disappeared almost overnight once the scandal hit the news. People who used to worship the Dapson name suddenly acted like they'd never known them. Meanwhile, reporters uncovered the truth about the company's early development. My name, my strategy, my work. Former employees began speaking publicly about how much of the original framework came from me. And for the first time in years, the truth actually mattered. A month later, I finalized the purchase of a new office building for my company downtown. The deed carried only one name, Natasha Dapson. Not Caleb's, not Richard's, mine. The morning we moved into the new building, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from Diane. I played only the first few seconds. Natasha, maybe we can talk like family. I deleted it before she finished. Then I walked into the conference room where my employees were waiting to celebrate our newest acquisition. 5 years ago, they threw me out because they thought I was powerless. What they never imagined was that one day I'd become the only person powerful enough to destroy the version of themselves they spent their whole lives protecting.